Hi, everybody. Welcome to Shisai Podcasts, conversations between scholars from around the world who study childhood, youth, and related institutions historically. As an official production of the Society for the History of Children and Youth, you can subscribe to these shows through iTunes or Google Play. Written and visual materials associated with each episode are available at our website, shcy.org. Enjoy.
Central Lancashire, and I am here speaking to my colleague and friend now for a long time, Chris Gerteis, on his wonderful book out from Cornell called Mobilizing Japanese Youth. Hi, Chris. How are you today?
Hi, Bill. I'm fine, thanks. This is kind of strange talking to each other like this.
It is. So I'm going to ask the question I've always wanted to ask you is, the last time I spoke to you before I heard you were writing this book, you told me I'm going to be looking at corporate governance. And then all of a sudden I hear you're writing this book. So tell me what happened.
Well, I came up with two possible book projects. And I was really into this one on risk, fiduciary risk, and marketing narratives that use history. And I worked it out pretty well. I had a pretty good concept there. And then I had this other proposal that I had really started developing in 2008 when I was on Fulbright in Japan, and I was bored with it by the time we were talking, which I don't even remember. It must have been 2014 or 2015 when I came back to this Mobilizing Japanese Youth project. And the reality is I got funding to finish the Mobilizing Japanese Youth book, and I didn't get funding to do the other one. So material reality bites, and I jumped at the funding and was able to go first for a year to Berlin to work at the Rework Institute Global History and Life course at Humboldt University of Berlin. And then followed on by a year back in Tokyo with one of those Global 30 Monkasho grants. So that determined what I would finish.
And how did you actually come across this subject? What made you identify the 60s generation as something worth, you're going to spend how many years? 3-4 years of your life writing about?
5 years.
5. There you go.
Yeah.
Halfway to becoming a teenager. There you go.
Yeah. Well, way back in the early 2000s, I got a nice grant from the Association for Asian Studies, the NIAC, the Northeast Asia Council, to go spend a few weeks in Hawaii and look at the collection that Patricia Steinhoff has put together on the New Left in Japan, with all these donated materials that no one wanted to keep in Japan. No one in Japan wanted this stuff from the New Left people, and so they sent them to Hawaii. And now the collection's even bigger and even better. When I started first framing what the book would be, it was entirely about the New Left, and I was basically going to retell the story of the New Left. Yeah.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but just for people who are not overly familiar with Japan in the 60s, what do you mean by the New Left?
Yeah. Well, very much like the 60s everywhere else in the world, that largely, the most visible being the student movements of the 60s, the anti-Vietnam War movement. Here, there's a huge movement in response to the increasing in fees and deduction or reduction of the student support allowance. There's serious concerns about governance structures within universities in particular, because these are the institutions that young people of that generation are more and more interacting with. A huge boom in the number of 60s generation, kids who were between roughly 16 and 24 in the late 60s. They're more and more going to university, and so they're interacting with old systems of hierarchy and tuning into the global movements like the Black Panthers in the United States, Tupac Amaru, or Shining Path, and there's a real fascinating discourse, to use a word, of these young people who are engaging with these ideas. This is reflected in the ephemera, the personal papers, the book collections that Pat Steinhoff has collected in Hawaii. This is great, but it's well-trodden territory. It's a story that has been told in Japanese over and over and over again. And so by 2015 or so, I realized I had an existential crisis and had to reconfigure what I was doing. And the purpose of the book for me changed. It's a long story, but I'm happy to talk about it. But it started out as a study of New Left youth. Yeah.
Right, and for anyone who's interested, Chris goes and looks at the way that a new generation of right activists are aiming to, as his book says, mobilize Japanese youth.
Yeah.
Now, so the question is, how is the experience? Is this a generational thing where the younger generation is sticking two fingers in the end, saying, to the parents, off you go on your bike, we're going to change the world, or is it something different in Japan?
I think it's the era where the notion of a generation really solidifies. I think that the first ideas of a concept of generation are written in the 1920s by a German sociologist, and I think he is observing the phenomenon, a post-World War I phenomenon, where all of a sudden an age cohort of young men are completely missing. And their absence, I think, causes him to think in terms of how historical epochs shape different age cohorts, and so we move forward. This is Carl Menheim, and so by the 1960s, I think that it's the concept of a generation has become part of popular consciousness, and I think that 60s youth, or those who are coming of age in the late 60s, are predisposed to be thinking of themselves as a generation, and predisposed to think of a generation as a group of people that say "up yours" to their parents. And I don't necessarily think that that's always been true throughout time. I think it's very much a phenomenon of the 20th century. That there isn't necessarily a community of people who think of themselves as the same age, with the same, we wear the same jeans, we use the same slang. We have to separate it from the individual lives of youth who are rebellious and want to tell their parents to, stick it. And then there's the larger social structures of how people operate. And this concept of generation is definitely the strongest for the 60s generation. I'm not sure that age cohorts after the 60s generation have as strong a sense of generation as the 60s generation, and I don't think that age cohorts before the 60s generation had a strong sense of collective identity. They may be the only generation in terms of music, cultural forms, and sort of expectations about life. Anyway, I mean, I'm just kind of spitballing it there, but these concerns are what drove the book. Where did this cohort of young people get their political consciousness? Where did they get their sense of cultural and political identity? And I chose to look at those who were not students, blue collar workers in particular, or people who came from blue collar families, and even working poor families. Their experience of life was really very different than your standard university student in the 1960s who had a very middle class life. And one of the things I do is I try to unpack what does it mean to be a middle class youth in the late 60s. So
the thing I actually really found interesting about your book is that, you know, 60s, the 60s generation in Japan is the generation that has no living memory of the war.
Yeah, right.
And then that becomes an issue, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's one of the things that it's one of the characteristics of their generation. It's one of the things that shapes their consciousness is they have no I mean, what constitutes the outer edge of the 60s generation are born right at the end of the war. But they're toddlers at the end of the war, and although their lives are shaped by the devastation that Japan experienced in the mid 40s, they did not specifically have strong memories of the war. And so I'm thinking in particular of the leading edge of the 60s youth being born in 43, 44. They would be roughly within the age cohort of right around 1968. They didn't have experience of the Asia Pacific War, but they did experience the Vietnam War from the perspective. And to a lesser extent, the Korean War. That the Korean War was very much hushed up in Japan, even though there's hundreds of thousands of American and Australian troops recreating in Japan in between battles. Public discourse up until 1952, the spring of 1952, was very tightly controlled by the American military government of occupied Japan. Whereas in the late 60s, there's even larger numbers of American, Australian, and British troops wandering around Japan, recreating in between battles in Vietnam. And there's huge amounts of war material transported through Japan. And there is rumors at the time of Japanese companies actually assembling and manufacturing some munitions for this war. Whether it's true or not is debatable. And one of the big ones, of course, in the late 60s is who's making the napalm that's being dropped on Vietnam.
Let's put this in the context.
Oh yeah, right. Yeah.
I'm going to ask you to put this in the context of why this is so shocking for someone living in Japan in the 1960s because of the Japanese Constitution.
Right. Yeah, and that's the thing. I keep putting the cart before the horse, but one of the central tenets of the 1947 Constitution, Article 9, forswears the state's right of belligerence, which is largely declaring that the Japanese state will not make war. There are some provisions for defense that emerge, but they're extra constitutional and perhaps extra legal. The military alliance between Japan and the United States is fraught with problems, legal and cultural, because of the centrality of Article 9. In survey after survey after survey, the Article 9 of the Constitution was overwhelmingly the most supported part of the Constitution. The Constitution establishes women's rights, it establishes intellectual freedom, it establishes the right to a minimum cultured livelihood, whatever that means. That none of those are as debated or as held centrally as Article 9, this forswearance of the ability to make war. And nevertheless, alliance with the United States requires the Japanese government to be an active part of the Cold War. And this Cold War in Japan shapes the consciousness of the 60s generation, because when they're 16 or 17 or 18 years old, America has just escalated its war in Vietnam, and they're dropping more bombs and sending more troops into Vietnam under the Johnson administration. As these kids are hitting their most formative years, 16 to 24, when their consciousness is being shaped and created, and their identities are emerging, they're coming face to face with media representations of this terrible thing that they didn't understand could happen, and they are beginning to see how Japan, as a place of hundreds of thousands of American troops at the time, is directly contributing to that war in Vietnam. Anyway,
Yeah.
I don't mean to.
No, I mean it's that's what makes sort of Japan's indirect involvement. Well, actually, it's direct, but the Japanese consider it indirect involvement in the Vietnam War so fascinating, because it does have all these reverberations within the Japanese fabric. Now, what I'd like to draw everyone's attention to is, if you go to a bookstore, just pick up the book and have a look at the cover. And the cover is absolutely amazing. And I would like Chris just to explain what we are looking at and what makes it interesting.
Well, yeah, I know my editor at Cornell found that image in a collection by an American photographer, and it was a little expensive to license it, but I'm really glad that we did.
Well, it's worth it because it's absolutely fascinating photograph.
Oh yeah, it's a collection of I would say between 16 and 20 years old, young men and a couple of young women standing around on the street corner, admiring these motorcycles that a couple of young men are sitting on. And a couple have got some cool hairstyle, and but by and large they just look like typical middle class kids, especially the young women who've even got their little hair scarves on, right? And this is not the student movement. This is not the New Left. This is the overwhelming majority of youth who are not yet political. They don't yet have a political position. They're surrounded in the late 60s by all this stuff, and they're certainly not ignoring it, but they haven't yet found that moment of radicalization, and may never find that moment of radicalization. And so part of what the book does is explores some youth who do not politicize in the way that is expected, but are pursuing their new consumerist lifestyle on motorcycles and in motorcycle gangs.
And which is seen as sort of dangerous to the fabric of the family, because it seems like traditional Japanese values are sort of being undermined. Which it's a wonderful way for me to lead you into. Tell us a little bit about the Japanese Ship Promotion Foundation, because I found this absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, well, this is the stuff that had never occurred to me before I spent a year in Berlin. And wandering around the Berlin, I was impacted by two architectural features, one very small and one very big. The big one's Tempelhof, the airport, which was constructed by Adolf Hitler's architectural crews to be the modern airport in classic fascist architectural style. And the physical experience of that era and that type of architecture is really mind-blowing for a historian. And maybe I was just ripe for that at the time, and I do tend to experience intellectual moments like this. I did in France back in my 20s as well. But for me, getting to Tempelhof and seeing the grand scale that fascism had in mind put me into direct dialogue with the rise of populism in the United States, the reemergence of the daughter of Le Pen, Marine Le Pen, the undercurrents of neo-fascist activity across Germany, the anti-immigrant movements in America, Germany, and France, and so I was predisposed to begin to wonder whether it was 1931 for me. I mean, am I experiencing this moment or not? And I'm happy to say that it didn't quite go that direction, though it's certainly not great. And of course, the very small architectural thing that I noticed everywhere is that in Berlin, it started as a community thing, but now the city puts brass markers, pounds them into the street at the addresses where Jews had lived who had been transported to the camps. And they're very, very small. And until you get down really close and read them, they could just be a surveyor's mark, right? But here they are, testament to one or two human beings who were disappeared from, you could imagine that it was from this location because this is where their home was. And I began to realize that big and small, the political mentality that we have really gets set in our teens and 20s. And I started exploring at the Rework Institute in Berlin some of the sociological theory of Mannheim, and talking the institute, the Rework Institute, it was a sociology of work institute that let a few historians in because they couldn't keep us out. And we had to have lunch together every week, and we made lunch for each other.
Yeah. No accounting for taste. I mean, what
yeah. That's right. So as I was thinking about the far right, I realized that I had been in a really unique position as an endowed lecturer at SOAS. The Nippon Foundation very generously endowed my position at SOAS and they paid a portion of my salary for 5 years. And over those years, I was invited to the Nippon Foundation many times to have coffee and talk to staff and pick up their official histories. And the more I read, the more I realized that this was a powerful and influential organization in Japan that had been led from the very beginning by a man who was an alleged, unprosecuted Class A war criminal. And what I mean by alleged unprosecuted was that as I dug into the American evidence in the War Crimes Tribunal and evidence still held in the CIA files, it was very clear that the things that he would have been accused of, he did. And his legal situation as a war criminal was abated when the Americans set him free, along with a variety of other war criminals. Alleged war criminals during the onset of the Cold War.
Someone has to fight for freedom, right?
That's right. They were let loose to combat the communists as what American intelligence officers believed would be the communists' natural enemy, the fascists. And Mr. Sasakawa established this foundation in the 1950s. And it was primarily there in the 50s to raise money for helping Japan rebuild its shipping organization. The foundation received all of its income from motorboat gambling, which he was granted the monopoly on. And this is small ticket betting, incredibly popular amongst blue collar men. And this is a transference of blue-collar incomes, which are spent on small-ticket gambling, into the coffers of a foundation that then distributed the money to the ship manufacturers of Japan while they rebuilt Japan's shipping business. And then, all of a sudden, by 1960, Japan's shipping business is paying for itself and doesn't need philanthropy anymore. So Mr. Sasakawa goes to the parliament and receives permission to revise the mission of the organization to spread the money for domestic development. So small projects across Japan get paid for, and there's several big ones. And then also international foreign aid. And it's not a small amount of money by its peak in 1993. They were distributing almost $1 billion a year. The Gates Foundation, which came up afterwards, was neck and neck with the Nippon Foundation for several years in the 1990s. And now, the Nippon Foundation doesn't have that kind of income anymore, but it certainly has tremendous amounts of influence. And Mr. Sasakawa in the 1980s used a significant amount of his influence to direct a lot of that money to very conservative, some very far-right organizations. And he very proudly declared his political leanings. He called himself, to a reporter from Time magazine, he declared that he was the world's richest fascist in the 1980s, and he had been a major force in the Taishuto, the masses party, one of the fascist parties in pre-war Japan during the war. And yet he is at the helm, literally at the helm of this philanthropic organization that is trying to shift the political consciousness of young people in Japan.
And they do this through these cruises, right? These peace cruises.
By the 1970s, they're sending these kids off on maritime excursions, sail training, maritime training, international tours. Everything has a paramilitary structure. This is one of his primary requirements, both in his organization and for the people who participate with his organization, is that they have to drill, they have to understand basic military hierarchies, and they have to be able to operate within them. And it's one of several aspects of his social agenda, including a reliance on Neo-Confucian educational systems.
So basically, what's happening is these students of these young children, from what ages were they?
Yeah, at first it's teenagers, but later the program expands into sort of a swimming pool and a sailing club program across Japan, and they build 800 swimming pools and marinas across rural Japan, and then they're teaching little kids from a centralized curriculum determined by the foundation, the rudimentary structures of military order. And it's important to understand that we don't have the Boy Scouts in Japan, right? We don't have compulsory military service. We have a very unpopular self-defense force, and that there is not it's not a militarized society like America, where as a kid, by going into scouting, I was being prepared for military service. That's the purpose of scouting.
I can never ever see you I can't even imagine you in a Boy Scouts uniform, to be honest.
Well, I didn't last, right? It wasn't really my thing. Americans are constantly being barraged with military mentality and training in military. And that just wasn't the case in Japan in the 1960s. that the Cold War was something that Japan had to participate in, but individuals were not mobilized for the Cold War. But Mr. Sasakawa tried to mobilize them for the Cold War, and he and his colleague Kodama Yoshio established and funded a new right military training camp. They gave speeches, and they tried to recruit the motorcycle gangs into these far right organizations, and it didn't go well. And that's why I put them on the front cover. The motorcycle gangs wanted nothing to do with them. They didn't want anything to do with the left either. They wanted to be left alone. They didn't want to be mobilized. And at the end of the 1960s, there's 20 or 30,000 of these gang members. But by 1975, there's more than 50,000 gang members. It's an incredibly popular way of being, a way of living. Which is just me stealing from Ian Hacking. But it's really important to understand that
So are they the Japanese Easy Riders, are they?
They are, but they're petty criminals. They're not major criminals. I mean, it's not like Sonny Barger and the Hells Angels, who were straight away deeply involved in the drug business. There's one gang that was very popular in Tokyo and still very popular today, the Black Emperors. In the 60s and 70s, forswore drugs. And hated the mobsters and hated the far right guys, and all they wanted to do was ride. So in that sense, it's the pure ride that you see in Easy Rider, where they're just going cross country and out for the freedom without the biker bar. Though there's certainly an element of the bad behavior and asocial behavior, but they're incredibly polite. There's a terrific documentary called Godspeed You, Black Emperor, and you get to see them operating, and they're good kids. Their only crime was that they're born to blue-collar families, and the police are predisposed to treat them like criminals. And I go into this somewhat in a particular chapter, but it's actually something that Bill and I are working on right now. We're going to expand that research a little bit and talk about this phenomenon of bosozoku in a more global context.
Well, that's another conversation. However, thank you for your time. I hope our listeners have enjoyed our talk and seen sort of the texture and complexity and what makes Japan interesting in that it experiences and reacts to these global forces like this, the 60s movement in a very unique way. That's both recognizable and yet different.
Yeah, that's right. Thank you. I think you put it far better than I did.
Well, I don't know if I put it better than you did. I'm just sort of, following your crib notes. Anyway, thank you so much, Chris. It's been lovely speaking to you as always. And by the way, Chris is a really, when he was young, he used to be a very a keen sailor. So I think he was born in Japan. He would have been very keen to join Sasakawa's group and live a life on the seas as a pirate.
As a kid, as a teenager, I actually did one of these programs in the United States and experienced that kind of mobilization.
Yeah, and loved it.
I loved it. Yeah. I didn't know any better. I was a dumb kid.
You're not supposed to know any better at that age. You're just supposed to love it. Anyways. Lovely talking to you, and thank you to everyone for listening.
Yeah, thank you, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and click off now and keep talking to Bill about other things. Bye, everybody.
Thank you for listening to Shusai Podcasts. You can find more materials and features from the Society for the History of Children and Youth online, shcy.org.